Ma'am, hospital staff exits through the back. This area isn't for you. The voice was cold, not loud. It didn't need to be yet. It was enough to erase a person's worth in a single sentence. She stopped short. The night shift had just ended. 12 hours without sitting down for more than 5 minutes. The smell of disinfectant still clung to her sleeves. She was exhausted, but she didn't lower her head. Back way. The words were repeated this time slower, as if spoken to someone who didn't deserve an explanation. No one around her spoke. No one met her eyes. She didn't argue, didn't apologize, didn't say who she was. She only tightened her grip on the shift badge in her hand and took one small step forward. Footsteps stopped behind her. 3 men in special military uniforms stood still in the parking lot. None of them were in a hurry. None of them asked what had just happened. One of them turned, looked at her, spoke her name. Ma'am, just a form of address, but enough to shift the air itself. If you believe there are women who carry responsibility in silence, please subscribe to Veterans Legacy Stories to listen to legacies that have never been called by name. She stood still, didn't step back, didn't move forward. Her hand stayed clenched around the shift badge, the thin plastic strap rubbing against skin already marked red after a long night. A faint smear of disinfectant still clung to it, not yet fully dry. She didn't let go. Not because it mattered, but because it was the only thing that reminded her she had just finished a responsibility no one in this parking lot could see. Her gaze stayed fixed straight ahead, not avoiding, not defiant. Just the familiar look of someone who had learned how to stand firm in silences where no one else chose to stand. Those eyes didn't carry physical exhaustion, but the clarity of someone who understood very well sometimes speaking only cheapens everything. Her breathing was slow, even, controlled like an old reflex left over from years when keeping the right rhythm of breath decided who lived and who didn't. No one taught her how to breathe in this parking lot. She had learned it long ago in places where silence was more frightening than noise. No one in the parking lot intervened. Someone looked away. Someone pretended to be busy with a phone. Someone paused for half a second, then kept walking. The silence settled into the open space heavier than the words spoken moments earlier. It wasn't loud. It wasn't shocking. It was simply there like a collective habit accustomed to a woman being told to step aside, accustomed to treating that as normal. She was used to this. It wasn't the first time she had been overlooked. Not the first time she had been spoken to in a commanding tone. Not the first time her worth had been reduced to a badge, a uniform, a position that didn't belong here. There had been days when she stood among men, big or tall or younger, and listened to them talk about things they believed they did better than she ever could. There were times she chose silence not because she lacked an answer, but because she understood that some people only listen when the truth enters the room before words do. She adjusted her center of balance just slightly. No one noticed. It was a small movement, just enough to steady herself after 12 straight hours of standing, walking, bending, lifting, supporting. Her posture remained upright. Shoulders didn't sag. Her back didn't curve. Not because she was trying to appear strong, but because she had never allowed herself to collapse in places that didn't deserve it. A voice sounded somewhere in the distance, not directed at her. A faint metallic sound touched the ground and fell silent. No one called her name. She didn't tell anyone she had stayed 20 minutes longer to hold the hand of a young soldier drifting in and out of consciousness. No one needed to know she spoke to him as if he were awake. And no one needed to know that her voice had been the only thing keeping him tethered to this world for hours on end. She didn't need recognition, didn't need thanks. She only needed not to be treated like an obstacle. The man from before was still standing there. The distance between them hadn't changed. The authority in his voice hadn't shifted. She looked straight at him. Didn't raise her voice, didn't explain, just one short sentence enough to keep her dignity without asking permission. I'm done with my shift. Not a request to pass. Not a justification. Just a fact. The air was still heavy, but her stillness began to carry weight of its own. And in that very moment, when she remained standing, when no one spoke up to defend her, when everything seemed finished, the initial contempt began to turn into something else, the unease of people who had never considered that silence itself could be a form of resistance. He repeated the command this time without looking directly at her. Ma'am, please step aside. We don't have time for this. The words landed cleanly cold and final, as if everything in front of him were nothing more than a meaningless delay. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't raise it. It stayed level, precise, just enough to turn a person into an obstacle. His eyes swept over the nurse's uniform she was wearing, quick, exact, and paused precisely where they needed to pause to classify her. No questions, no confirmation. Every conclusion had already been made in his mind. A very small laugh came from somewhere in the distance. No one laughed openly. Just a short sound, half-formed, quickly swallowed back. But it was enough to say that someone had understood the situation. In a very familiar way, a tired woman standing in the wrong place. She didn't turn around, didn't look toward the laugh, didn't look back at the man who had just given the order. The shift badge was still in her hand, her thumb pressed firmly against the edge of the plastic, more out of habit than intention. It wasn't clinging. It was control, a small action to keep herself from reacting on the instinct of people who had never been forced to endure long enough. "We need a clear path," he added, his voice now stripped of its last trace of courtesy. No one in the parking lot objected. No one said the words were excessive. No one pointed out that she wasn't blocking anything at all. There are humiliations that don't require crude language. They live in the way people stop seeing you as a person who deserves explanation and start seeing you as a situation that needs to be handled and cleared away quickly. She stayed where she was. Her shoulders didn't tense. Her chin didn't drop. Her posture remained straight, the way she had held herself for years, not to prove anything, but because she had never allowed contempt to change the way she stood. He waited for her to step aside. She didn't move. "Ma'am." His voice was lower now, tighter. She turned and looked directly at him for the first time. Not for long, not deeply. Just long enough for him to realize something deeply unsettling. This was not the look of someone confused, nor of someone asking permission. That gaze was familiar with pressure, familiar with orders, familiar with being judged in a matter of seconds. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Not out of fear, but because she had learned that there are moments when words only make humiliation more public than it needs to be. He interpreted her silence in his own way. A slight step forward. A very small hand gesture, just enough to indicate direction. Not rough. No contact. Just a reminder she should know her place. Someone behind them began to shift. A few footsteps slowed to watch. Curiosity surfaced not because of her, but because this moment was lasting longer than usual. She felt it clearly. The half-hearted attention of people who only stop when something feels off rhythm. But they still didn't stand with her. They stood with convenience. She inhaled, slow, deep. No one heard it. But it was the breath of someone who had once stood before orders far colder than these and had learned not to let them decide who she was. "It's nothing," a voice called out from somewhere behind, indistinct. "She probably doesn't understand." She heard it. She understood perfectly. She understood that the deepest humiliation here wasn't in the words of the man standing in front of her. It was in the fact that everyone assumed she needed an explanation, while no one felt the need to offer an apology. She didn't explain. She stayed still for one more beat. Long enough for the discomfort to spread beyond her. Long enough for the air itself to begin feeling cramped with its own silence. And it was precisely then, when the humiliation was held inside that silence, when no one expected any other response, that the footsteps behind her suddenly stopped altogether, as if something had shifted, something no one yet knew how to name. A voice rose behind her, low and clipped. "She's with us." Not loud. No emphasis. Carrying no explanation at all. Just one sentence. Enough to make the air hesitate. The man blocking her path froze mid-gesture. The hand that had been pointing was left suspended. His eyes shifted toward the source of the voice and stayed there longer than necessary. Not out of fear, but because he was trying to fit together something that didn't quite align. Who was us? There was no immediate answer. 3 men stood there. None stepped forward. None moved aside. They didn't need to form a line. The space between them was even revealing a long-learned habit, standing together not to show off, but to control a situation. The man from before didn't apologize, didn't step back. He stayed silent. This silence was different from the ones before. It wasn't avoidance. It was hesitation, something rarely heard in a voice accustomed to giving orders. He started the question, trailing off unfinished. The man who had spoken didn't answer right away. He didn't look directly at the one blocking the path. His eyes paused on her very briefly, very lightly, like a confirmation that didn't need words. Then he faced forward again. "She's finished for the day." His voice remained low, but steady. No command, no request, just information placed exactly where it belonged. The man in front of her inhaled more noticeably than before, a breath he didn't quite manage to control. His gaze passed over the three men, then returned to her. For the first time, it didn't slide past quickly. It stopped, not on her face, but on the way she stood. Straight posture, open shoulders, no sign of yielding. Power didn't change hands instantly in that moment, but it had already left its old place. It no longer sat solely in the voice that issued commands. It began to spread slowly, but unmistakably, into territory no one in this parking lot was used to navigating. "We need to maintain security," he said, his voice altered now. Less sharp, still trying to hold control. The man behind her gave a slight nod. "We understand." A brief pause. "And we take responsibility." No ranks were mentioned, no units named, no badges or papers were produced. Only the way they said "we," as if it were a title heavy enough on its own. Another man in the group shifted one step. Not forward, just enough to stand level with the speaker. No signal was needed. It was the reflex of people used to working together in situations where mistakes weren't allowed. The man blocking the path saw it, understood enough not to ask further. The atmosphere began to change. People farther away stopped looking at their phones. A few gazes turned toward the group of four, this time no longer with casual curiosity. She still didn't speak. There was no need. Her presence in this moment wasn't the center, but it was the anchor. The three men weren't standing there to protect their own honor. They were there to confirm that her silence from the beginning had never been weakness. The man from earlier lowered his hand, very slowly, as if trying to do it without anyone noticing. A half step backward followed, not enough to call it yielding, but enough to break the block. "All right," he said. It wasn't clear who he was speaking to. There was no apology, no admission of fault. But the old order had cracked. The three men didn't move right away. They didn't need to. The shift wasn't in footsteps, it was in who now had to think before speaking next. She looked straight ahead, didn't turn around, didn't search for anyone's eyes, because she knew from this moment on the questions would no longer be aimed at her. And as the new silence barely had time to take shape, another voice, more formal, more precise, was preparing to give a name to the truth that no one had placed correctly until now. One of the men in the group turned toward her, not the one who had spoken earlier. It was the man standing slightly to the left, his gaze calm, his voice lower and slower. "Ma'am, are you the nurse assigned to Petty Officer Chen?" The form of address shifted within the question itself. No longer the cold ma'am of an order. No longer the commanding tone used to clear a path. This voice carried caution, not from fear, but from respect. She looked directly at the man who had asked. No need to think long. No need to weigh her words. No need to glance at the other three men for confirmation. Yes. Just one word. Short. Enough. No one asked anything further. No one requested identification. No one asked which shift, how long, or why. The man who had asked nodded, very slightly. A nod not meant to end the conversation, but to acknowledge a truth that had just been found. He turned to the other two men. He said nothing, only a look. Both of them nodded almost at the same time. No verbal agreement was needed. They had heard enough. She noticed the change immediately, not in words, but in the way they stood, and how the distance between her and them was no longer the boundary of strangers, but part of the same situation. The man who had been blocking her path watched without intervening. His gaze passed over each face, then settled on her. This time there was no hurry, no classification, just a look trying to understand. "You were with him throughout the night shift?" The man continued, his voice still even. "Yes," she replied. No added detail, no claim of credit. A brief pause followed her answer, not because information was lacking, but because it carried weight. The man nodded again, this time deeper, not to confirm a fact, but to grasp what it meant. He didn't need to know exactly what she had done, only that she was the one who had been there when no one else was. "Thank you, ma'am." The words were spoken very softly, but clearly. Not a courtesy, not spoken on someone else's behalf, just words said in the right place at the right time. She didn't respond, not because she hadn't heard, but because she understood this thanks didn't require a reply. It asked for no equivalent answer. It only needed to be accepted in silence. One of the other two men stepped half a pace forward, not closer, just enough to speak without raising his voice. He doesn't have any family. His voice was low. We're his team. No one explained what kind of team. No one said where they came from. She nodded. For the first time during all of this, she nodded on her own. Not because she had learned something new, but because something had finally been placed where it belonged. He's not alone, she said, her voice low. Certain. All three men looked at her. No surprise. No doubt. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the words had come from the one person who had the right to say them. The man who had blocked her path cleared his throat, very lightly, more habit than intervention. So, do you need anything else? His voice was completely different now. No edge, no urgency. No one answered right away. One of the men glanced toward her as if asking a question that didn't need to be spoken. She shook her head, very slightly. He's stable, she said. For now. No one asked more. No one questioned it. In that moment, recognition didn't come from insignia, rank, or title. It came from the fact that the men standing in front of her chose to trust her words, not because they had to, but because they understood she had reason to speak them. She wasn't elevated to the center. No one stood at attention. There was no ceremony, only a truth placed back into the hands of the person who had carried it through a long night. And it was precisely in that silent recognition that something else began to take shape, no longer a question of who she was, but the truth about the one lying behind the doors beyond them. The man standing closest to her spoke first. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need emphasis. We're his team. The sentence was short, but the way he said it meant it required no further explanation. Not colleagues, not a support unit. A team, one word enough to draw the line between people who work together and people who live and die together. He's in the ICU. Another man continued, his voice rougher, as if he had just left a very long road behind him. We flew back as soon as we could. She listened. Didn't ask why. Didn't ask from where. She nodded very slightly. The truth didn't surprise her. It only named what she had felt through every night shift, that the soldier wasn't alone, that the silence around his bed wasn't abandonment, but the temporary absence of those who couldn't get back in time. We came here because of you, the first man continued. His tone didn't change, but his pace slowed. She lifted her head, this time not to react but to receive. Because of me, the question came out without suspicion. Just a very human need to confirm. He nodded. Didn't look to his teammates. Didn't need them to affirm it. Because you stayed with him. A brief silence settled between them. No one rushed to fill it. The man who had once blocked her path stood still. His arms hung loose. His eyes faced forward, no longer searching for control. No one in the parking lot laughed anymore. No one whispered. The small background sounds faded as if someone had signaled for everything to stop, though no order had been given. The third man stepped half a pace forward, not to take center space, but to say what needed to be said. He doesn't have any family. His voice was low. We were overseas when it happened. She inhaled. Not deeply. Not hurriedly. He's not alone, she answered, her voice steady enough to need no proof. All three men looked at her. No one disagreed. No one corrected her wording. The truth had been spoken from both sides, and it fit so naturally that no further confirmation was needed. The first man turned toward her again. This time he stood straighter, not out of ceremony, but out of habit when speaking things that must not be said wrong. You stayed with him when we couldn't. He spoke slowly, each word clear. You stayed with him when we couldn't. The sentence landed without echo, but it carried weight. It wasn't praise, it wasn't thanks. It simply placed a truth where it belonged, where no one could deny it. She didn't respond right away. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because statements like that don't require words in return. The man who had once issued orders didn't bow his head. He didn't apologize, but he stopped trying to insert himself. That was the only change, and it was enough. We're going to see him, the second man said. Just for a moment. She nodded. He'll hear you, she said. Even if he's not awake yet. No one questioned it. No one doubted. They trusted her words the way they trusted field directives that had already been proven true. "Thank you, ma'am," the first man said again. "Nothing more." She didn't answer. There was no need. In that moment, their identities were no longer a mystery. But what mattered more than who they were was why they stood there and why they chose to speak the way they did. Silence settled over the space. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of people who understand that some things only need to be acknowledged once and then carried quietly. And when the truth had finally been brought to the surface, when every gaze had shifted, something else began to emerge. Not identity anymore, but the way human beings face one another's dignity once they truly understand. The man who had blocked her path remained still for another beat. This time not because his authority had been challenged, but because he no longer knew where he was supposed to stand. His arm shifted slightly, then stopped, as if the familiar reflexes he relied on had suddenly lost their footing. I didn't know." His voice came out lower than he likely intended. Not an excuse, not a plea for forgiveness, just a belated truth. She looked at him. Not for long, not closely. Just enough for him to understand that his words had been heard. "You didn't need to know," she replied, her voice even, neither heavy nor light. "You weren't supposed to." The sentence ended there. No further explanation. No extra words to instruct or analyze. No moral boundary drawn. No lesson wrapped into a slogan. He blinked noticeably, as if realizing that what unsettled him wasn't that he had disrespected the wrong person, but that he had grown used to a system where people believe they have the right to demand others prove their worth. He started to add something, then stopped. She didn't wait. She didn't need to hear the rest. "It's okay," she said. Not to comfort him, but to close it. The way she ended the exchange didn't create a victory. It didn't turn anyone into a loser. It simply returned everything to its proper place, a place where no one needs to explain why they deserve to be treated with basic dignity. One of the soldiers glanced at the man very quickly. No judgment in the look. Just enough to remember. Not to punish, but to avoid repeating it. The man bowed his head slightly. Not a formal apology learned from protocol. Just the reflex of someone who had realized he'd been standing in the wrong place at an important moment. "Have a good day, ma'am," he said, his voice no longer sharp. She nodded. Didn't smile. Didn't turn cold. Just the nod of someone who had chosen not to carry this moment any farther than necessary. No one applauded. No one stood at attention. There was no dramatic moment. But the atmosphere had changed. Not because someone had been elevated, but because someone had been returned to the right place, no higher, no lower than anyone else. One of the soldiers spoke softly toward her. "We'll go in with him," she replied. "He'll hear you. Just 2 sentences. Enough." The man from before stepped aside. No one asked him to. No one signaled. He did it on his own, and that action spoke louder than any apology. She turned away. Not slowly, not hurriedly. Her steps carried neither the relief of someone just vindicated, nor the bitterness of someone once humiliated. They were simply the steps of someone accustomed to leaving places where she no longer needed to stay. The shift badge was still in her hand. Now it was just a thin piece of plastic, no longer clenched tight. Her shoulders relaxed a fraction. No one noticed the change, but it was there, unmistakably real. Behind her, the men paused for another beat. Not to watch her go, but to understand that some lessons aren't delivered through commands or warnings. They come from how a person chooses silence, chooses forgiveness, and chooses not to turn herself into the center of everything that just happened. She didn't need them to remember her name. Didn't need them to retell this story. She only needed that from this moment on, another woman would no longer be told to use the back entrance, simply because no one imagined she could be carrying a story larger than her appearance. And when everything seemed to have closed in that silence, that very silence began to leave its mark, not on a report or a record, but on how the people who remained would carry themselves starting the next day. The next morning, nothing became louder. Just different, very slightly. A brief notice was passed down through the area. Not long, no explanation. Just a few lines clear enough for everyone to understand the way staff addressed medical personnel was being standardized. No more clipped commands. No more words that made someone wonder whether they were standing in the wrong place. Access procedures were adjusted as well. Not to create more distance, but to remind everyone that each person stepping out of a shift carries a responsibility already fulfilled and deserves to be treated as a human being who has just come through a long night. No one mentioned what had happened the night before. No one spoke her name in any exchange. No special report was filed, but the change was there. A young staff member at the entrance hesitated before speaking that day. He glanced at the badge on her chest, then looked her in the eyes and chose his words differently. "Good morning, ma'am." His voice wasn't confident, but it was sincere. She nodded. Didn't correct him. Didn't remind him. He learned that lesson not out of fear of being reprimanded, but because he had seen something the night before, something that wasn't written down yet, strong enough to reshape how a person chooses to behave. She continued her work as usual, changed clothes, wore her badge, took her shift. No one gave her special attention. No one asked further questions. And that was precisely what made everything right. She didn't become a symbol. She wasn't pushed to the center of a story she had never wanted to tell. She moved through the familiar rooms, checked vitals, adjusted blankets, spoke to those who couldn't respond. Her voice was the same as always, calm, clear, free of excess emotion. But those who remained understood that some shifts don't end when the clock says so. They end when you know you didn't leave anyone behind in silence. At the end of her shift, she removed her badge and folded it neatly in her hand, no longer clenched tight, no longer held as something to defend, just an object returned to its proper place. She left the area the way she always did, without looking back, without leaving a trace, returning to her role as a nurse, one she had chosen from the beginning and had never considered small. But the legacy of that night didn't leave with her. It stayed in how people addressed one another. It stayed in the pause people took before giving an order. It stayed in a young person knowing when to step back, not because they were told to, but because they understood. Legacy is not rank that makes others bow. Legacy is how we teach those who come after us when to step aside. She didn't need anyone to remember her name. Didn't need delayed thanks. Didn't need to be mentioned as an inspirational story. She only needed this small world, a hallway, a parking lot, a shift to change just enough so that the next woman wouldn't have to hear the words she once did. And that was enough. Veterans' legacy stories. We remember the quiet heroes. If this story makes you look at a woman with deeper respect, please subscribe to Veterans' Legacy Stories so that women veterans are never forgotten.